Oh, should I read?
Yes, please.
Oh, all right. Thank you. In human form, the soul achieves full and complete consciousness. Therefore, the soul, having now gained full and complete consciousness in human form, does not need any more or any other higher forms to evolve consciousness. This consciousness is full and complete. Though this soul has gained full and complete consciousness, it is still not at all conscious of itself as one, indivisible, eternal, and infinite, and does not experience infinite knowledge, power, and bliss. But it is only fully conscious of its identity with human form and its varied aspects, and experiences the gross world in full. The soul with full consciousness is still unconscious of its original infinite state because of the unwanted, though necessary, burden of the gross impressions of the human form, from which the consciousness of the soul dissociates as that form drops dead. These impressions of the human form now dead still cling to the full consciousness gained. And as usual, the consciousness of the soul centralizes itself in these gross impressions of the human form just dropped. In trying to unburden consciousness of these impressions, the gross consciousness of the soul tends the soul to experience and exhaust these impressions through innumerable opposite experiences taken through a series of reincarnations. In this process of reincarnation, the consciousness of the soul, while trying to liberate itself from the burden of impressions, gets still further entangled at every stage of reincarnation. When a complete balance of experiences of opposite impressions is just about to be attained, it is just then disturbed by the consciousness of the soul associating itself with the next new human form. Absence of this association would otherwise have neutralized the effect of the impressions by an equal balance of respective opposite experiences, and would thus have liberated the consciousness of the soul from all impressions of opposites. Here, the simile of a perfect balance would be appropriate. The consciousness gained by the soul during the process of evolution resembles the indicator at the fulcrum of a perfect balance. And the two pans of the balance are filled with the unequal weights of opposites of impressions, such as virtue and vice, etc. In this way, consciousness, acting like the indicator at the fulcrum, tries to gain equilibrium, which is impossible as long as there are in existence unequal impressions of opposites remaining to be experienced. It is therefore that the gross consciousness of the soul constantly seeks to experience the predominant opposite impressions in order to gain a total equilibrium of the impressions of opposites. But the tragedy is this: that as soon as the gross consciousness of the soul tends to reach the 0 point of equilibrium by gradually experiencing the predominant opposite impressions, it so happens that the consciousness of the soul invariably gets too engrossed in experiencing the predominant opposite impressions and experiences them or exhausts them to such a degree that these predominant opposite impressions are now reduced, that is, through experience, to such a level that those impressions which were overbalanced by the original predominant opposite impressions now become predominant. And a great disturbance of balance or equipoise occurs. Wherefore, consciousness, acting like the indicator at the fulcrum, swings or switches in just the opposite direction of its original experience. It is at this juncture that the consciousness of the soul turns towards the experience of the newly predominant opposite impressions through another human form. A human being takes form or birth as a medium to satisfy the demanding need of the consciousness of the soul, which now seeks to exhaust or spend or experience the more predominant opposite impressions. It is but natural that the predominant qualities manifested now by this human soul will be in accordance with the predominant opposite impressions, of which this new human form is but the mold. Thus, in the process of reincarnation, the fully gross conscious human soul, fortified with fully developed subtle and mental bodies, though unconscious of these, must necessarily experience countless varied experiences of impressions of opposites. The impressions which are diametrically opposite in a chain of unending experiences. Through its association with the gross body, the soul seeks to exhaust its previously accumulated opposite impressions, but rarely succeeds in doing so. On the contrary, it often accumulates fresh impressions of opposites. When the gross form is about to exhaust the impressions which brought it into existence, it is dropped. The residual opposite impressions lead the soul to heaven or hell in accordance with the predominance of virtue or vice. In discarnate existence also, all opposite impressions seek to be exhausted through the subjective experiencing of vivified impressions. But even here, in the state of heaven or hell, the equipoise of impressionlessness, that's impressionlessness, is generally approximated but missed, and the residual predominant opposite impressions goad the consciousness of the soul to associate with a new gross medium. Complete equipoise is lacking in death as well as in birth. It can only be achieved in the gross world. Therefore, an endless chain of lives in the gross sphere is sustained by residual impressions until consciousness succeeds in getting established in impressionless equipoise.
Thanks, Marian. Anne Elizabeth.
At every stage and in every state of reincarnation, the consciousness of the fully human conscious soul gets firmly centralized in the more and more concentrated impressions of human forms with which it has identified and from which it has dissociated. There seems to be no escape from these concentrated impressions. These impressions must be experienced and exhausted. And the more the impressions are experienced, the more the impressions become concentrated. I have to stop for a minute. Somebody's knocking at my door. Excuse me.
Sure, no problem. Ernie.
The only solution to thin out this concentration of impressions is for the consciousness of the fully human conscious soul to experience increasingly and more rapidly these impressions in such a way and in so great a frequency that every impression is experienced, and the impression that this experience created should be counterbalanced somehow by an opposite impression.
Go ahead and read the asterisk there.
Okay. Knowing that creation is not an accident and that it has a deeper meaning than is apparent to the eye, the seers of all ages have time and again drawn the attention of the world to the fact that although for a certain period of his life on this planet, man may identify himself exclusively with the life of the senses, his transcendental destiny is God realization. Maulana Rumi and his Masnavi has a parable that illustrates this. The cub of a tiger happened to be reared amongst a flock of sheep. As the cub grew up, it developed all the traits of the sheep and grazed and bleated like them, so that it never thought of itself as anything different from the sheep. One day, however, a tiger from the jungle approached the one from the flock and said to him, "Do you know that you are a tiger like me and not one of the sheep?" Thereafter, he coaxed the strayed tiger to look at its image in a rivulet nearby and succeeded in enlightening it as to its true nature. The moral of this fable is that man also knows himself to be identified with the world of the senses and seems to have no way of escape. But there is a way of escape, for eventually a master appears who enlightens him. He is then redeemed and finds himself in the course of time face to face with his ultimate goal, God realization.
I'm back.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Ern. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Throughout the process, is that where we are throughout the process?
Yes.
That looks, there's no escape. The only solution, did you already do that one?
Yeah.
Oh,
So
I'm sorry.
we're up here throughout the process.
Okay. Throughout the process of reincarnation, this play of balancing and counterbalancing the opposites of impressions continues. And on this play is sustained the reincarnation process. On this play depends the eventual emancipation of the human conscious soul from the chains of ignorance and the ultimate realization of capital self-consciousness. Thus, in the process of reincarnation, the fully gross conscious human soul must necessarily experience innumerable and diverse experiences of impressions of opposites. The impressions which are diametrically opposite in an apparently unending chain of consistent experiences. Therefore, while the gross conscious human soul, which is now fully conscious, undergoes the experience of opposites in the gross world, the consciousness of the soul has to identify or reincarnate itself a number of times as a male, then as a female, and vice versa, in varied castes, creeds, nationalities, colors, and in different places, as rich one time and then as a pauper, sometimes healthy and sometimes sick, and so forth, all the while reviewing opposite impressions, creating opposite impressions, and simultaneously exhausting them by opposite experiences. And there's an asterisk. Sarapa azu hone nebada karadiya ham ko. Bagara ham kuda tegar dil bimandwa hota. Mir taki. The fact that I am weighed down from head to foot with desires has made a slave of me. I should be God in reality, were my heart and mind desireless. It is only through these diverse opposite impressions and their respective opposite experiences that the gross conscious human soul in the gross
I think you I think you missed a paragraph. It is this cycle of deaths.
No, I'm the one above that.
No, you just read the asterisks and then.
Sorry. Okay. No, I didn't. No, it just sounds the same. It is only through these diverse opposite. Yeah, I did read that. It is this,
It's okay.
it is this cycle. I must be off tonight. That Domino's call that wasn't mine threw me off. It is this cycle of deaths and consequent births of human forms that ultimately results in inciting the fully evolved consciousness of the gross conscious human soul to involve this consciousness to that depth where the fully involved consciousness of this soul realizes the reality of the infinite eternal state of the self, capital Self. This process of involution of consciousness gradually takes place as the gross impressions of the opposites gradually become fainter and less concentrated. At this stage, the consciousness of the gross conscious human soul gradually gets dissociated from the gross world as the involution of consciousness infolds and gradually dissociates from experiencing the impressions of the gross world. This involution of gross consciousness is only possible when the opposite impressions gradually, after a very, very long process, thin out through the process of unfailing reincarnation, which leads to the limit of gross impressions of the opposites and gross experiences of the opposites. It's the end of that chapter. Do you want me to keep going or you want someone else to read?
Yes, please. Another 5
Part-
minutes.
Part 5, the planes. Involution of liberating consciousness. When the consciousness of the soul is ripe for disentanglement from the gross world, it enters the spiritual path and turns inwards. Its gross impressions now become deep.
Less deep.
Yeah, less deep. I was just looking the asterisk that said facing page 59. I don't know what that refers to. unless it's a chart. Yeah, chart refers to planes and worlds, chart 1. So its gross impressions now become less deep. They become fainter or more subtle, with the result that the soul now becomes subtle conscious. This is the first step in the involution of consciousness, which is striving for liberation from the burden of impressions. A number of cycles of births and deaths in the human form have to contribute towards that ripeness of gross experience, which ultimately propels the consciousness of the soul onto the path of liberating involution, on which impressions become fainter and fainter and eventually disappear. Gross impressions become subtle impressions. Subtle impressions become mental impressions, and mental impressions are ultimately wiped out, leaving consciousness free to reflect the truth. The process of involution is generally gradual. Man's heritage of form, as well as impressions, is from animals. So the gross impressions are very strong. In extremely rare cases, the gross impressions can suddenly disappear, and the free consciousness of the soul experiences the oversoul. But it is more usual for the gross impressions to become fainter and fainter, thus getting converted into subtle and mental impressions, and then fade away completely. As a general rule, the soul, which has started on its homeward journey, does not come back to the gross world in which it had lost itself, as if in a wilderness. As a general rule, the soul, which has started on its homeward journey, does not come back to the gross world in which it had lost itself, as if in a wilderness. This does not mean that the subtle conscious soul does not take a gross form or dwell in the gross world with its gross body. It means that the consciousness of the soul is no longer entangled with the gross form or the gross world, and that it is chiefly engrossed in the subtle world. As a general rule, the soul first snaps its link with the gross world, then with the subtle world, and lastly with the mental world, and comes to realize itself as beyond all these. While it traverses this path, it crosses 6 planes, of which the first 3 belong to the subtle world. The 4th is on the borderline of the subtle and mental worlds, whereas the 5th and 6th belong to the mental world. The soul, abiding everlastingly in the oversoul, is beyond all planes.
Thanks, Anne Elizabeth. Ernie, back to you.
First and second planes. As the gross consciousness of the gross conscious human soul gradually involves, this involving gross consciousness experiences partially the first plane of the subtle world through the medium of the fully developed subtle body of the soul. At this stage, the involved gross consciousness of the gross conscious human soul gets the first glimpses of the first plane of the subtle world and experiences these glimpses or impressions partially through the gross body and partially through the subtle body. Here, both the gross and subtle senses are used simultaneously. This is the stage when it is said that the human soul stands, as it were, on the line of demarcation, as shown in the sketch. which demarks the gross world from the subtle world. The consciousness of this human soul experiences strange things. With his gross eyes, he sees glimpses of the subtle plane. With his gross ears, he hears celestial music of the subtle plane. And with his gross nose, he enjoys subtle scents. In short, the gross conscious human soul, partially on the first plane of the subtle world, experiences subtle impressions with gross senses. Gradually, with further involution of gross consciousness, the gross conscious human soul experiences completely the first plane of the subtle world. Now the gross conscious human soul is no longer gross conscious, but is subtle conscious. This subtle conscious human soul gradually becomes conscious of the second plane of the subtle world. This subtle world is the domain of infinite energy, the infinite power of God, which then translated into the finite, here manifest in the form of the infinite energy of the subtle world. When in human form, the soul has subtle consciousness, it is unconscious of the body, gross, and mind, or the mental body, but it does work through the gross body and through the mind, parens mental body, not directly, but on the subtle plane. So even if the subtle conscious human soul is unconscious of the gross body and mental body, and therefore does not realize the gross and mental worlds, he can use the gross body through various aspects of the gross, such as eating, drinking, sleeping, seeing, feeling, hearing, etc. And he can use the mental body through various aspects of the mind, parens mental body, such as desires, thoughts, and emotions. The subtle conscious human soul on the second plane, with greater involution of consciousness, is gradually gaining consciousness of the infinite energy of the subtle world and is capable of performing tricks or minor miracles of a lower degree. For instance, with one wish, he can make a dry tree green, and vice versa. He can stop railway trains and motor cars, fill a dry well with fresh water, and so forth. This subtle conscious human soul on the second plane experiences the subtle world with the subtle senses of his subtle body. He is now totally unconscious of the gross world, although from all outward appearances, he remains and functions as an ordinary man, eating, sleeping, and having feelings of pain and pleasure, etc. Yet actually, his involving consciousness experiences not the gross, but the subtle world, and creates fresh, subtle impressions only of the sights, scents, and sounds of the subtle world. Third plane. Further involution of the subtle consciousness of the subtle conscious human soul makes the soul experience the third plane of the subtle world. Here the subtle consciousness gains greater consciousness of the infinite energy of the subtle world, and the soul experiences greater finite power. Here he is capable of performing grand miracles, such as giving sight to the blind and restoring limbs to the maimed. Here the subtle conscious human soul is also capable of experiencing the different planes and worlds of the subtle sphere. Just as a gross conscious human soul is capable of traveling from Asia to Australia or America using the gross vehicles at his disposal. I'm going to read that again, if that's all right. Here, the subtle conscious human soul is also capable of experiencing the different planes and worlds of the subtle world, just as a gross conscious human soul is capable of traveling from Asia to Australia or America using the gross vehicles at his disposal.
That was subtle sphere.
Oh, thank you. Well, let me go back. Third time lucky. Here, the subtle conscious human soul is also capable of experiencing the different planes and worlds of the subtle sphere, just as a gross conscious human soul is capable of traveling from Asia to Australia or America using the gross vehicles at his disposal. The second and third planes of the subtle sphere are the two major planes, which are solely in the domain of the subtle sphere. The first plane is partially in the domain of the subtle sphere and partially in the gross sphere. Similarly, the fourth plane is partially of the subtle sphere and partially of the mental sphere. This fourth plane is known as the threshold of the mental sphere. Fourth plane. With a gradual and further gain in the involution of the consciousness of the subtle conscious human soul, the consciousness of the soul inclines the soul to experience the fourth plane. On the fourth plane, the soul is fully conscious of infinite energy. It is the very same infinite energy which is the shadowy aspect of that infinite power of God. Here the soul is equipped with full power and is even capable of raising the dead and of creating new forms and worlds, breathing with life. The Vidyan conscious souls of Qutub state or perfect masters control such a happening and see that such gross mishaps do not come to pass unless preordained.
So that's referring back to that sentence that you read over and over about people traveling is what I think it's referring to.
Yeah, the asterisk is right. Let's see, I can't see above that.
It's 6, footnote 6.
Let's go on, please, without interruptions.
On the fourth plane, there are no occult powers. They are divine powers. As shown in the sketch facing page 55, the subtle conscious human soul on the fourth plane, possessing the key to the store of infinite power, is seen on the threshold of the mental world, confronted by the full blast of intense desires and emotions, which are the aspects of mind, of capital mind, of the mental world. At this stage, the soul experiences, as it were, a state of the darkest night. He finds himself caught up between the devil and the deep. The overpowering incitement by intense desires to wield and use this infinite energy at will proves a treacherous foe at this juncture when the involution of consciousness of this subtle conscious human soul is unfailingly progressing rapidly towards gaining mastery over all desires.
Thank you, Ernie. Mahu.
Yes. If these desires at their zenith overpower the soul on the fourth plane, and if the powers are misused, then the experience of liberating this infinite energy invariably proves fatal at this juncture for the soul on the fourth plane. The result is that all of the consciousness gained by the soul is violently disintegrated, and the soul retains only the most finite consciousness and identifies itself once again with the stone form. This soul then has to pass through the whole process of evolution from the stone form onward to regain full consciousness. The soul of the fourth plane has semi-subtle and semi-mental impressions. He is subject to most tantalizing temptations because he has intense and overpowering desires, good or bad. Being in possession of tremendous power, he is impelled to make good or bad use of it. If he misuses his power for the satisfaction of lust or for the sake of craving for name and fame or for some other low purpose, there is a sudden fall of this consciousness of the soul, causing it to revert to the stone stage of consciousness. But if by overcoming his temptations, he makes good use of his tremendous powers, or does not make any use of his powers, he goes into the fifth plane, where he's safe and has no possibility of downfall. But also, if he makes good use of the powers, he is sometimes pulled up into the sixth plane by the Vijnana conscious souls of Kutub state or perfect master, but not Jivan Muktas and Majzubs, only perfect masters. Good use of power in the gross world may be directed towards material and spiritual ends. For example, wealth might be spent for the material well-being of others, as for charitable hospitals, relief for the starving and the distressed, etc., or for their spiritual well-being by providing them with a spiritual instruction and spiritual possibilities. But in the fourth plane, good use of powers invariably consists in harnessing them only for the spiritual well-being of others. These powers can never be used to bring about material prosperity for anyone. That definitely is a bad use. We might take the following as an example of good use of the powers of the fourth plane. Suppose a spiritual pilgrim is going through a desert and is on the point of death due to unquenchable thirst. The soul of the fourth plane can appear to him in the gross body and give him relief by giving him a jug of water and then disappear. Such use can be termed good use. Powers can be used for individual or collective good, but even good use binds and arrests the further progress of the soul. That is why the fourth plane is the most difficult to cross and is fraught with greatest dangers. The person who is stationed on the fourth plane finds it most difficult to abstain from wielding the tremendous powers at his command for the fulfillment of his overpowering desires. The fourth plane is the threshold of the mental world. On this plane, more than on any other subtle plane, the spiritual pilgrim is particularly susceptible to having a precipitous fall.
Precipitous.
Precipitous fall. Thank you. The crisis which confronts the soul of the fourth plane is grave and hazardous because he comes into the possession of stupendous divine powers before having brought his mind into complete subjugation. He cannot control his mind completely because unless and until he rises onto the fifth plane, which is of the mental world, he cannot directly experience or use his mind. Like the gross conscious human soul, the subtle conscious soul of the fourth plane also uses his mind indirectly. Now on the fourth plane, the mind is fully alive. It is functioning in all its fully developed aspects of thoughts, feelings, and desires, which are at the zenith of their overwhelming intensity. On the one hand, the soul is trying to gain mastery over its own insurgent mind and bring into subjugation the subversive forces of desires let loose. On the other hand, the limitless energy of the planes is completely at his disposal and is constantly seeking some expression or use. If the soul yields to the overpowering temptations to put his powers to wrong use, there is an enormous psychic crash of unimaginable magnitude. The explosive forces thereby released bring about a complete disintegration of consciousness, subjecting it to a cataclysmic,
correct?
Yeah, cataclysmic downfall from the heights of the subtle consciousness of the fourth plane to the very lowest depths of rudimentary stone consciousness, which the soul experienced in the very beginning of evolution. This psychic cataclysm of disintegration is comparable to the fusing of an electric ball due to an irreparable short circuit. The fallen soul has now no alternative except that of again going through the long and laborious ascent of evolving consciousness through ages of evolution and reincarnation, through numberless forms, and then again gradually and patiently ascending through the planes.
Thanks, Mahu. This disintegration of consciousness occurs only in the case of fourth plane consciousness, and that too rarely. Only when the powers of the fourth plane are misused. It is a fact, normally, that when consciousness is once gained, it can never be lost. But the case of fourth plane consciousness is the one exception. If the soul does not misuse the powers at his command, but uses them for good without being overpowered by desires, then with further involution of consciousness, the consciousness of the subtle conscious human soul sometimes experiences directly the sixth plane of the mental world and skips over the experiences of the fifth plane of the mental world. We have an asterisk here. Entry into the mental world comprising the fifth and sixth planes may be compared to an entry into a room after crossing the threshold, the fourth plane of consciousness. Back to the text. But if this consciousness of soul on the fourth plane of consciousness neither uses nor misuses the powers of the fourth plane, then gradually, with further involution of consciousness, the subtle conscious human soul on the fourth plane crosses the threshold of the fourth plane and enters the mental world on the fifth plane. Fifth and sixth planes. With greater involution of consciousness of the subtle conscious human soul on the fourth plane, the consciousness of the subtle conscious human soul identifies itself with mind, capital M, of the mental planes and experiences the mental world. This mind of the mental planes has two sections. In the first section, the state of mind is inquiring or reflecting. In this state, mind functions as thoughts, high thoughts, low thoughts, good thoughts, bad thoughts, material thoughts, spiritual thoughts, and so forth. In the second section, the state of mind is impressive or sympathetic. In this state, mind functions as feelings, feelings of sufferings, emotions, feelings of desires, longings, feelings of pangs, separation, and so forth. When mind of the mental world has distinct dual functions, it is necessary that the experiences in the field of mind, that is, the mental world, must be distinctively of two kinds also. Thus, the mental world has two domains: the domain of the fifth plane of consciousness of thoughts, and the domain of the sixth plane of consciousness of feelings. Asterisks. The difference between the involving consciousness of the fifth and sixth planes may be compared to the difference between the angles of vision of a man entering a room, the mental world. On entering the room, if the man looks straight ahead of him, he spontaneously sees God face to face, thereby gaining directly consciousness of the sixth plane. But if his vision happens to focus on one of the corners of the room, then he first gains only the consciousness of the fifth plane. Back to the text. Therefore, the consciousness of the mental conscious human soul on the fifth plane identifies with the first section of mind only and is conscious of that state of mind which is inquiring or reflecting mind. Thus, this mental conscious human soul of the fifth plane is the creator and master of thoughts and is capable of controlling only the thoughts of all gross and subtle conscious souls. This is often misinterpreted as controlling the minds of all gross and subtle conscious souls. He does not control the mind as a whole, but controls only that state of mind which functions as thoughts only. The mental conscious human soul on the fifth plane of consciousness, while identifying himself as inquiring or reflecting mind, emanates only thoughts, does not identify himself with the second state of mind, and is therefore incapable of establishing mastery over feelings, emotions, and desires. However, with greater involution of consciousness, the mental conscious human soul on the fifth plane gains consciousness of the second state of mind of the mental world in the sixth plane, and thus tends to identify himself as that mind in the second state, the impressive or sympathetic mind. Thus, the consciousness of the mental conscious human soul has involved sixth plane consciousness of the mental world. The mental conscious human soul of the sixth plane consciousness experiences the mental world through complete consciousness of feelings, and thus has no thoughts at all, but actually feels that he is conscious of the feeling of seeing God face to face continuously in everything and everywhere. He sees God continuously, but cannot see himself in God as God. Therefore, he cannot reconcile his feeling of sight of God with his own identity with God. And thus he longs for, feels for, has pangs for union with God, whom he sees face to face. This identification with the second state of mind, feeling, is the predominant aspect of divine love, which ultimately leads to union with God. We had an asterisk there that says, this is not to be confused with our ordinary way of seeing an object with our ordinary eyes. To see God face to face is to apprehend God through the one and only sense of the mental plane. And this sense is of seeing. Here the pilgrim has the intuitive recognition of God.
Anybody, I think it's important that they.
So we got to page 49 and we'll stop here. and pick it up next week. Hang on, let me stop the recording.